For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass S. 1543, the Suicide Training and Awareness Nationally Delivered for Universal Prevention Act of 2021, or the Stand Up Act.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 1543, an act to amend the Public Health Service Act to provide best practices on student suicide awareness and prevention training and condition state educational agencies, local educational agencies, and tribal educational agencies receiving funds under Section 520A of such act to establish and implement a school-based student suicide awareness and prevention training policy.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, and the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on S. 1543.
Without objection.
And Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise today in support of S. 1543, the Suicide Training and Awareness Nationally Delivered for Universal Prevention Act, also known as the Stand Up Act. Americans are facing a growing mental health crisis, and that crisis is hitting our nation's youth particularly hard right now. While the challenges of COVID-19 amplified this crisis, children and young people in the U.S. have been experiencing rising rates of mental health conditions and suicide for years, particularly among youth of color and LGBTQI young people. Between 2008 and 2018, the suicide rate amongst adolescents and young people increased by nearly 60%. Today, Mr. Speaker, suicide is the second leading cause of death among children and young people between the ages of 10 and 24. Black youth are nearly twice as likely as white youth to die by suicide, and the rate of suicide amongst American Indian and Alaskan Native youth is 2.5 times the overall national average. Meanwhile, the suicide rate among young Hispanic women increased dramatically in the decade leading up to the pandemic. Additionally, LGBTQ youth are at greater risk for depression and suicide. According to a 2020 survey, 50% of LGBTQ youth considered attempting suicide in the prior year. And all these trends are alarming, so much so that pediatric experts have declared the state of children's mental health a national emergency. And last December, the Surgeon General Murthy, issued an advisory on the youth mental health crisis. Today, the House is continuing its critical work of considering legislation to address the crisis. The Stand Up Act would require state and tribal education agencies to establish and implement a suicide awareness and prevention training policy for middle and high school students. The policy would be required for any agency receiving funding through the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA's, Project Aware funds, and it would need to be evidence-based as well as culturally and linguistically appropriate. Last May, Mr. Speaker, we passed the House companion of this bill with bipartisan support here on the House floor after it had passed out of the Energy and Commerce Committee last Congress. I commend the lead House sponsors of the bill, Representatives Peters and Bilirakis, for their leadership on this issue. As chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, I strongly support legislation that will help bring awareness and promote best practices on suicide prevention among our nation's youth. So, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support S. 1543, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
I rise today in support of Senate Bill 1543, the Suicide Training and Awareness Nationally Delivered for Universal Prevention, or Stand Up Act. The House version of this Bill, H.R. 586, was led by Representative Scott Peters, along with Energy and Commerce Committee colleagues Bilirakis, Blunt, Rochester, Upton, and Tonko. It passed this chamber unanimously last May, and this legislation helps promote suicide awareness and facilitates prevention training for students and young Americans. For the last decade, suicide has been the second leading cause of death for Americans ages 10 to 24, and the 10th leading cause of overall deaths in the United States. Initiatives that empower students with knowledge of the warning signs and resources for prevention can help in preventing suicide, which this legislation will help to accomplish. The pandemic has greatly impacted the mental health of Americans across the country, It is critical that we continue addressing these growing challenges and to work to prevent youth suicide while promoting the mental wellness of all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll reserve my time. I have no further speakers.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I have no additional speakers either. So if the gentleman would
I'll
close.
yield
Gentleman from
back.
Kentucky is
Mr. Speaker, I'll yield
recognized.
back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would urge support. This bill is bipartisan, and again, we'd be sending it to the President with our action today. I yield back.
The question is, will the House suspend rules and pass Senate 1543? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
And Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass S 1662, the Supporting the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health and Reagan-Udall Foundation for the Food and Drug Administration Act.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 1662, an act to increase funding for the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the Food and Drug Administration and for the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, and the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend the remarks and include extraneous material on S 1662.
Without objection.
And Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise today in support of S 1662, the Supporting the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health and the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the Food and Drug Administration Act. In December, this chamber considered and passed the House companion of this legislation by a vote of 374 to 52. Earlier in the year, the legislation advanced out of the Energy and Commerce Committee, where it garnered bipartisan support. I'd like to commend the House bill's sponsors, Health Subcommittee Chairwoman Eshoo and Representative Hudson, for their strong leadership and commitment to this bill. The Foundation for the NIH is an independent, nonprofit organization established by Congress in 1990 to develop private-public partnerships and advance American leadership in biomedical research. Likewise, the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA was established by Congress in 2007 to advance the mission of the FDA and catalyze innovation, modernize medical product development, and improve safety. The NIH and FDA are authorized to transfer funding to their respective foundations, but that limit has not been increased since 2007. So this bill, S 1662, would increase the transfer authority for both foundations, allowing the foundations to continue and expand upon the important work they've been doing. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, they have done important work to enhance the FDA and NIH's work on COVID-19 vaccine and diagnostics. Now, this bill will help build upon our ongoing efforts to advance biomedical research and promote better public health outcomes. And so, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support S 1662, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak about S 1662, the Supporting the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health and the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the Food and Drug Administration Act. The companion version of this bill, H.R. 3743, was led by my Energy and Commerce Committee colleagues, Representatives Hudson, Eshoo, and passed in the House in December. Unleashing biomedical innovation in the United States is critical in saving lives and maintaining our global competitiveness, as we saw how important it was to invest in creating new treatments during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we need to carry that momentum into the future. S 1662 authorizes increased transfer authorities from FDA and NIH to the Reagan-Udall Foundation and the Foundation for NIH, respectively, allowing FDA and NIH to transfer these resources to these public-private partnerships to give the Reagan-Udall Foundation and the Foundation for NIH more flexibility to meet the growing research demands and accelerate future medical innovations. And I just want to close with this. I was in Brussels last week. I'm on the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, so I was with our allies as everything took place that we all saw in Europe. And this is the Energy and Commerce Committee. We've done some wonderful work on these bills, and they're important. But I will tell you, as this talked about innovation and world leadership reminded me of this. And, you know, we were energy independent a year ago, a couple years ago. And I will tell you, it is struggling for people in my part of the country. I'm sure it's all over the country for what they're paying at the gas prices. But I will tell you this, I was with our European allies, and they are terrified about what this is going to do to the oil markets. And what we're doing now is just not sanctioning the Russian oil because we're all terrified of it. And so hopefully, being the Energy and Commerce Committee, we'll have the opportunity to look at the policies while we're no longer in energy independent and how we can move forward. And I saw the president's spokeslady, Ms. Psaki, talking on an interview show yesterday, and they asked her, said, was the president going to do something to relieve fossil fuels? And her answer was, well, this just shows why we shouldn't be dependent on fossil fuels. Well, the answer is this is why we shouldn't be dependent on foreign fossil fuels when we have them available to ourselves. And of course, the interviewer didn't ask the follow-on question, well, maybe that's the case, but what are we going to do in the next weeks, months, and through the summertime? And I'll tell you, we all know, because we see it on television, it is a dire situation. But when you look them in the eyes and you see it in the faces, the Ukrainians are eligible to come to this meeting, but obviously they weren't there. We did have Zoom meetings with them. But we looked at our European allies, and they're just, it's a tough situation. We can make it better. We can make it better for ourselves. We can make it better for them. And I think it's the right thing to do. So hopefully we have the opportunity to move forward. But the bills that we're talking about today in my subcommittee are important, and I recommend that this one be passed as well. And I have no further speakers, so I can yield back if you have no further speakers.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no additional speakers either, so the gentleman can. And
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would ask that, again, bipartisan support for this bill, which I also believe would be going to the President, and I yield back.
Question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate 1662? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.